talk through stuff. I think ultimately my goal for this is that we can, we're getting close to the migration. HIP 80 potentially could be a blocker for it, or you can make an argument that it is, and I think I'll let Noah actually make that argument on why it could be, and then I wanted to sort of hash out some of the concerns that people have brought up over the last couple of days in the channel, which I think are all reasonable concerns, but maybe just have a voice chat to talk through some of that stuff. My goal is if we sort of start with the argument on whether or not this is worth getting to a vote before the migration, and then we talk about the actual individual parts of the HIP, and then we can sort of decide if we want to bring it to a vote in its current state, or if we want to maybe wait. So that's it's kind of my thinking, if that works for you all. Crickets. Uh-oh.
So
can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah. I just
okay, good. All right.
So I guess one thing is, Noah, what happens if we don't get a vote?
So if we don't get a vote, then we end up with the system we have now, with onboarding fees, effectively set to 0 for mobile, which then makes that part of their utility score 1, which isn't great. But there's also, I think something like this is going to be a lot harder to change once it's out there, because it's going to, if you go and change the utility score while we already have a utility score running, it's going to adversely affect one DAO. It's almost certainly going to help one DAO and hurt the other one. So it's something that you probably want to, get right, or directionally close to right the first time. But there's also just a lot of, kind of implementation around this. So, if we simplify the utility score as in HIP 80, we can actually remove a lot of code and a lot of dependencies, which means less things to keep track of on migration day. So I think it is very important that we, try to vote on this before the migration.
One question. If we don't get a vote, how many hotspots would be onboarded into the mobile sub-DAO?
As many as there are right now. Basically, the migration onboards all of the ones from FreedomFi and I think Bobcat 5G into mobile.
So all the hotspots that have onboarded onto IoT will get onboarded onto mobile?
Not all of them, just things from mobile makers, right? So if your hotspot was made by FreedomFi or Bobcat 5G, you'll get onboarded to both IoT and mobile, at least on chain. And as far as rewarding is concerned, you'll be onboarded to both.
Okay.
Because we don't want anybody, being rewarded right now and then suddenly it stops.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm happy to chime in on kind of where I'm sitting at with it, because I've given this a lot of thought and trying to understand exactly what the purpose, motivations are. And I do agree with Noah that it is a lot harder to change something, and you're going to get accused of changing things post migration, especially this is very much relating to taking a VC. So I think that the question we have to, in my opinion, have to have this. The solution has to be pretty solid before the migration. whatever it is. But I do also worry that there's no matter how the score is formulated, from what I'm seeing is there is a total disagreement between IoT side and mobile side about how this should be accomplished. But I think whatever happens does need to happen pre-migration, just as my 2 cents.
Could someone summarize the two sides of like the IoT side and the mobile side of this? It might be useful to just have that. And I think Adrian or Wakeform's going to be taking some notes, so hopefully we'll get some. So we'll be able to post those notes after. Anyone want to take a stab? Guess not. Chris, do you want to take a stab at sort of describing the HIP, maybe just to like get folks comfortable with what's in the HIP itself?
Yeah, sure. So basically, we started with the problem with missing onboarding fees for mobile, and then from there we kind of tried to just develop a model that would have similar results. And the question is, what results do we want? There was an idea that we're going to protect IoT from dropping off a cliff when mobile comes in and starts burning huge amounts of data credits. That was kind of promised before HIP 51 was voted on. And there's this one quote from Capcom where he says IoT will be getting 97% of the HNT at launch. That was like a year ago or something. But anyway, there was this idea that we're just going to give some sort of helping hand to IoT. And that was really the main reason, as I recall the discussion, for this A score, which counts the active hotspots of a sub-DAO and their onboarding fees. And the score is a bit difficult to understand, in my opinion, especially what is a fourth root. I think most people haven't really seen a fourth root up close. And if you look at it, though, what does happen is you get a factor that helps IoT because they just have 400,000 hotspots online, and each of them is paid $40. And what happens to mobile? Well, they have 0 hotspots, so that part of their score just stays at the minimum of 1. And I did post early in the discussion screenshots of my wonderful numbers tables. I'll just pull them up again here, comparing the scores between the HIP 51 formula and the HIP 80 formula. And so the idea was, can we do something similar? Can we give some sort of helping hand to IoT in a different way that's maybe easier to understand? And we discussed this various places, and the idea is, if we just look at the square root of the data credits, that mostly is what we're interested in the end. And so the proposal was, let's just treat IoT as if they're earning some reasonable amount of data credits, even if they aren't, as a way of helping them up the step until people like Neil finally have all their wonderful applications deployed and running. And Then another thing came up at the last minute. JMF brought this up. He was saying we need to think again about the V factor in the score, which multiplies everything by the amount of staked or delegated VEHNT to each score. And the thing is there, if somebody just stakes a whole, locks, got to keep these straight. If somebody locks a bunch of HNT and then delegates all the VEHNT at one sub-DAO, it has a huge influence because there wasn't any square root there in HIP 51, and he could basically slam one sub-DAO all the way to the top, and everything else would be marginalized. And so JMF was saying, let's use a square root on the VEHNT too. So we basically just said, let's take the square root of the product of VEHNT and the data credits. And then the idea was, let's just forget about the A factor in the original score, which counts the number of hotspots, and instead, let's explicitly say how much of a helping hand we want to give IoT. So the version that's published has a floor value of $75,000 worth of IoT per month that we're going to assume IoT is burning even if they aren't, until they manage to develop and deploy solutions that actually do burn IoT. And I think Arman was saying we're currently doing something like 1,500 a month. So this is like, what is it? Factor 50. We're giving them an advantage of factor 50 right now. And you can see in the examples I posted that by HIP 51, with some arbitrary assumptions right at the beginning, IoT would get almost all the HNT because mobile hasn't onboarded any hotspots. And then later, if mobile is doing a lot of data transfer, then mobile would get, what does it say here? Just an example, 92.6%, and IoT would get 7.4%. And so in the HIP 80 formula, we said, let's try to get something similar. And it works out that if the mobile burn goes up, we get a similar result. IoT is getting a bit more, but mobile is still getting like 90% of the HNT. So it's not like we're actually taking things totally away from mobile. We're just giving the IoT sub-DAO a bit of a help in the medium term. And in the short term, we're helping mobile over the bridge of these missing fees. So that's where that comes from. And another part of this in the end was that since we don't actually count the onboarding fees to anything, we said, why don't we just sort of de-emphasize these onboarding fees altogether? And we could just drop a minimum way down. Everybody can onboard with $5, which prevents nuisance attacks, but it makes it much cheaper to deploy hotspots like there's this $100 LoRa hotspots being proposed right now or even ready to ship. And we've heard that Nova is working on short-range Wi-Fi hotspots that could run mobile that also could cost around $100. And in each case, these $40 onboarding that are being currently charged would be a huge drag on deployment. And if we just drop the onboarding fees down, we can help the networks grow. So I think that's basically my overview of what we were trying to get at. I hope I didn't forget anything right now. Any questions on that, maybe? No questions. I'm not sure.
No question. So the bullet points that I heard there is, or at least as far as I've heard, are one, we wanted to, or the sort of purpose of the HIP is to address the fact that there is no mobile onboarding fee. That's one. And two, we want to, if we did decide to drop the onboarding fee as one option, we need to make sure that there's still one of the reasons for the onboarding fee in there was to sort of protect the IoT network, at least during the growth phase. And then 3, some sort of simplification of the score. And then 4, it's also to reduce the total onboarding cost. I feel like at the very least, the reduction of the onboarding cost is maybe tangential to if we sort of remove it. It's maybe a separate hit, but I could make that argument certainly. But the other stuff I think at least makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree that we could certainly.
I don't disagree. Oh, sorry.
Excuse me. We can certainly take the onboarding fee portion out of the HIP. It's not necessary. It just seems like a reasonable place to put it in because I don't understand why anybody would be against setting a low minimum for the onboarding fee. And if people don't feel comfortable just setting the onboarding fee straight away to 5, we can just define a minimum and tell the sub-DAOs they can drop it, just suggest that they drop it. And if anybody's against that, we can just take that out. It's not essential.
Tyson Stack, you've got a hot mic. By the way, I'm not sure if you're trying to say something.
Yeah. I get all the main bullet points, and I guess I'm 50-50 on whether or not the reduction of the onboarding cost part is completely relevant to this discussion. But I do think that we do have to kind of come to a consensus on the formula, and at the very least, it needs to be like very rigid in terms of what the expectations are. Because if people start delegating stuff and then they feel like the ground is moving underneath them, that's gonna be a negative impact on Helium.
Yeah, I mean, uncertainty is definitely not okay here, right? So, like, I think having very clear, this is what it's going to be, both right now, and this is what's being defined in the HIPs. And also, here's what's going to be after the launch of the sub-DAOs. I think we just have to have clarity on it. And, I would argue that there's probably folks out there who are right now thinking, I'm not sure if I want to delegate at all, because I just don't know what the system looks like. And I think that would be a reasonable take. And that's one of the reasons why I want to resolve this as soon as we can and get this to a vote, so it, at the very least, creates some clarity.
Right, that's exactly where I sit. Where I'm completely unsure exactly what my staking will essentially become. So I think that is a very big. But some other, I don't know. I've been spitballing with some other people as well, and nothing, obviously, Chris, I think I really appreciate the effort you've put into this. But I'm not sure that going down the route that we're going down to actually will lead to a successful outcome. Because there is when I look at the metrics, we have essentially Helium has a limited amount of expenditure available to them in the form of their emission schedule. And I think that at the end of the day, IoT's growth will be slow and steady, which is good, but it's going to take a long time. Whereas I think objectively, and I'll check my bias right here, that I am a huge provider of mobile, so get that out in there. That I think that there is a major incentive for IoT for the short term to subsidize mobile, because that would mean larger median growth. Because I just think that the metrics were much more desirable for a lot of people. Whereas as long as IoT just basically survives for the next 2 to 4 years, that you will see tremendous, if it grows maybe say 25% per quarter. And I don't actually even think that a lot of extra monetary incentive is even required to make that happen. It's happening. Maybe disagree or agree or disagree with me on that, but I'm wondering if more of a system where there's a pot of money that's being given to the sub DAOs and then just let the VDA score kind of sit as it is, where that might help incentivize newcomers as well. I think that's another thing that I think goes into this huge calculus of how do you create something that's fair between IoT and mobile, but even third, fourth, and fifth sub DAOs that aren't even proposed yet, without having to radically change something. I think that's a very, very tall task, and I'm not sure that the current system of the VDA score or even Chris's HIP 80 proposal will ultimately solve that in a satisfactory way.
I could say something to that, maybe. I think the one thing I think it's useful to look at is I posted in the HIP 80 channel now, again, 3 comparisons, and these are all with arbitrary numbers, but you can just look at the numbers and see what it says. And if you compare with these arbitrary numbers of, let's say, 400,000 IoT hotspots and some different numbers of mobile hotspots, it tends to allow for this discrepancy with the missing onboarding fees as well. But if you compare the scores and the percentages of HNT going to IoT and to mobile, you'll see the HIP 80 score and the HIP 51 score doesn't differ by a huge margin. It differs a bit, and you can adjust that depending on where you set this floor. We just had this arbitrary suggestion that we treat IoT as if it's earning $75,000 a month, and currently it's not. And then we could look at that, or we could also just say, what if we set that to $20,000? That's a valid discussion to have. And then if you set it to $20,000, the numbers look quite similar in the various different scenarios. That's the green screenshot I posted in the HIP 80 channel. So if it's a matter of are we treating IoT too generously, well, we can just reduce this floor, and we just need to pick a number that we can reach consensus on. The IoT people are happy with, and the mobile people are happy with. And basically, it's a philosophical thing. How much do we feel we should give a helping hand to the other network? Because I think together we'll be stronger. But I think the math gets very complicated if you try to prove exactly which combination of what is the fairest. But the other thing is, HIP 51 takes the linear VEHNT delegation into account. And as JMF was pointing out, one problem with that is that you could get a distortion of the score, because after a certain large amount of VEHNT has been delegated to one sub-DAO, it becomes, from a certain economic perspective, undesirable to delegate to any other sub-DAO. Whereas by taking the square root, we soften that impact. But another effect is, since the score rises more slowly, the higher the amount of VEHNT gets. I posted another table showing that in the HIP 80 channel, and you'll see that if we use the square root V advantage factor, as I put it, then even a sub-DAO with a small delegation of VEHNT can get a significant portion of the HNT emissions. And if we want to encourage additional sub-DAOs to join, and that's another philosophical discussion to have, how eager are we for random sub-DAOs to join? But I think it's probably a good idea to be inviting to new sub-DAOs. By using the square root on the V factor, we make it much more approachable for new sub-DAO to join. So just as one example, Max was saying, what if we have 1 billion VEHNT delegated in total? Now, if we have that split half and half between one subDAO and the other half, the other subDAO, then their V advantage factor, as I was calling it, is 50-50. But if we have one subDAO with 995 million VEHNT and the other has 5 million, so a very skewed distribution, then with the linear score is calculated in HIP51, the one gets 99.5% advantage, which also gets multiplied with the other factors, of course. But if we use the square root, then the major subDAO gets 93.4%, which leaves 6.6% for the minor subDAO. So by taking the square root of the delegation, we make it much more approachable for new subDAOs to join. So to the extent that people are saying we need to find a way to make it easier for subDAOs to join, the square root on the VEHNT factor is very important. So that's one reason I would, for that purpose as well, just recommend let's just go with the HIP 80 score instead of sticking with the HIP 51 score. And I think those are basically the two alternatives we're discussing right now, because I haven't seen anybody propose a different formula. If anybody has one, please post it.
Sure, a lot to agree with there, Chris. I think I do agree that we are definitely stronger together, and I think that's kind of like there's a synergy here that I really like, but I'm just trying to figure out a way, because essentially I think when you're talking about that square root function of the VEHNT, you kind of come to the conclusion that you're just trying to soften the edges basically, because even with that square root function you were talking about, 7% is still pretty small. But I another modifier to something you had put forward, and this is something I just spitballed. But if you just have a pool, like an untouchable pool of the rewards going and then splitting it between the subDAOs, something like somewhere between like 10 and 25%, and then that's split between how many different subDAOs there are. That way there's just a known, you get past the approval of becoming a separate subDAO, that you would know, okay, now that pool, so if it's just 2, then you're getting 50% of that pool. If it's 3, you're splitting it 3 ways, and so on. And that way it would always kind of be known what your reward expectation would be and what your metrics would have to be in order to meet it. So I think that's kind of one of the biggest problems with any kind of super floating formula, is at the end of the day there's this huge calculus that can change on a dime if something gets unbalanced quickly. And even using something like a square root function, I find it helpful, but I think it still doesn't quite meet the minimum requirements in order to make it stable enough to say, okay, if I do this, I will at the least get this. Which, coming from a place of business, I look at that and saying, I can't risk with that low level of certainty about how something is going to happen. So I think we have to, the point of the floor in your calculation is to create some sort of known stability. But anytime you add it into the equation part, it still can vary widely enough that it's that a lot of business minded people look at that as too unstable. Just
Well, there's one thing I disagree with this approach, and that's the idea we have a fixed bucket of rewards. And that's really not true, because we have a fixed number of HNT that are being minted every month, and they're being distributed, but that's not actually a fixed reward, because what is going to happen if we have one subDAO, let's say mobile, that's extremely successful and burns a huge amount of data credits? That's going to correspond in the end to real world value that's all flowing into the blockchain. And so the fixed number of HNT being distributed will have a different value than if the one subDAO is not making an overwhelming contribution to the share. So just the idea we can take a fixed percentage and divide that up among, I don't know, upcoming sub-DAOs. I don't see that really works because we have no idea how big is the pie that we're distributing. And one of the central ideas in the Helium model is we're not just distributing a pie, we're trying to grow the pie. And that's why we want more sub-DAOs, and that's why we want everybody to burn more HNT, because the bigger the pie is, the bigger even the small slices get. And so that's why I think the approach that we have to sort of reserve a slice, a fixed percentage slice, for sub-DAOs that would otherwise get marginalized, if the pie grows, I don't think that really makes sense. But the other thing I'll say here, and I don't want to sound combative, but I've heard lots of suggestions here on individual points. But if anybody would just post a model and say, these are the numbers we get, that would make it much easier to discuss things. So far, we've had lots of proposals on individual little bits of things with no models. And here we have models. It's a very imperfect model, but we have numbers we can look at, and we can say, are these numbers any good, or where do we need to make the numbers better? So that's really a discussion I would like to have.
I think it's only Max that actually opposes it majorly, so you just need to ask him if he wants to write another one or not.
Yeah, we've had the dueling HIPS proposals before with HIP 76. I'd rather not go there, but in the end, if people say one proposal is no good, there is always the option they could make a different proposal. I agree with that.
Right. I guess and I think actually, just to be honest, I think I don't find it combative. I wanna find solution. I'm always forward looking for the solution. I don't think the solution here is easy. I think that's the biggest problem. But I guess I've worked with I've been playing around with the VDA score for weeks now and trying to figure out exactly how this would work and how this would work in terms of interoperability, or in terms of like sharing their it's like I said, it's very complex, and it's amazing. It's always amazing to me to see how little of an effect certain things have. Like, especially if you look at the original VDA score, just adding like $10 to the DC onboarding is enough to like completely skew it towards mobile. And I think that'd be a pretty easy hip to pass, just to say, leave the VDA score as it is. Just pass that we'll pay $10 in H&T to onboard on that side, and you flip it heavily in favor of mobile by doing that. That's why I don't think it can really sit as it is, because a lot of incentive to do that. But at the same time, I guess I'm trying to understand in terms of like the fixed pool question that you think, and I've heard this mentioned. I think Neil just mentioned that here about, well, okay, if we set aside a slice of the pie for different sub-DAOs, then I'll just create a sub-DAO, scoop up rewards, and then just disappear. But I think all you have to do is create some sort of like bonding schedule, some sort of skin in the game element that would completely dissuade somebody from attempting to do something. But yet you're guaranteeing them a certain amount of income stream that they can get their project in and up off the ground. I think it's the entire point of why somebody would join as a sub-DAO, is that A, you're getting brand recognition, and B, that you're getting a fixed stream of income regardless of your immediate effect, and that would give you time. And I think another thing too is that there should be almost some sort of negotiation between all the different sub-DAOs and new potential prospect sub-DAOs. That should be like, okay, we vote to allow you in, and if you don't get in, you don't. And then there's even certain aspects like okay, you've got 6 months to burn this amount of data, or else you get hit with this penalty. You know, whatever. You can come up with any kind of metric. I think that that's kind of the missing piece to understanding how the interoperability of new subDAOs is it needs to be figured out. Is we need this portion HIP 80, let's say, the main quotient to figure out is how do you solve the formula for sharing rewards between the two, and also while setting aside the future prospects for new subDAOs to come onto the scene. But there should be a completely separate negotiation on a per diem basis for new subDAOs, period. Because each one is going to be radically different than the other. I mean, we talked about mappers, decentralized storage. There's a long list. So I think that it's very important that we just get the math of this making sense, and like you said, the original goal of this is simplicity, and to some degree. Well, I agree that simplicity is a nice attribute. That when you rank it among the three of saying, you know, you want it fair, you want it to spur growth, and then you want it to be, simple to understand. But if you had to pick two, simple's the one is the one I'm going to get rid of. So in terms of, and I think that growth is quite frankly the most important thing, maybe even more above fairness per se. But take that with
Now, let me just say one thing here, maybe. If you do the math, I gotta take a minute here now, maybe, and do that. But if you just look at, let's say, under the HIP 80 score, we have one new subDAO that burns 0 data credits, and we stake, let's say, 10 million VEHNT, that's $100,000. If we have the current prices, that's something that's absolutely achievable. So with 10 million VEHNT and a floor of 1 per epoch, and you add it up, I think you'll determine that you actually get a significant portion of the total emissions just by making that first initial VEHNT investment to stake to the new subDAO, just with the minimum floor of 1 in 30 epochs. So maybe I'll need to take a minute to work that out. But if you try, I was looking at it earlier. I think it's something like 0.1% of total HNT emissions or something you can capture with 0 effort with a new subDAO. And if we're actually doing significant revenue in the other subDAOs, I think that's quite a lot, and should let anybody enter the system. And if we have a floor that lets a new subDAO enter, then above that, they have to work on how much DC are they actually going to burn, how much data are they actually going to transmit, and then they can compete on a level playing field. And due to the square root, their benefit is much larger than it would be if it were just a linear function. So I think there's really a very good path for anybody to enter. And on the other hand, the DAO can always decide whether they think a new subDAO would be a good addition or not, whether it would actually contribute significant burn in the end, because as I understand it, we will always have a vote to admit a new subDAO or not. So if it's something that people think is not a good idea, that's not going to be a good fit, that's not going to contribute, we can always reject it. So both sides, I think, are pretty much covered enough. And if somebody could just figure that out, I'd be happy about that.
Chris, One thing that you said there, figure that out. What was that? I think I missed it. That's
Yeah, just do the math and figure out how does what share does SubDAO get that's just launching, that just is delegating, let's say, like 10 million VEHNT compared to the mobile SubDAO going full blast. And I just started on a sheet of paper here, and I think I'm going to, like Groot says here, can't do the math. Don't understand the fourth root, apparently. Either he means me or he means him. I can go with both.
So to try to move this conversation towards like a potential of a vote or not, which I think like sort of what I started with. I think we need to figure out if this is important enough for us to vote on before the migration, or if it's important for us to continue having a conversation. It sounds like there's two things that I heard that I think make sense. One, if there's a competing proposal, I think we need it like by tomorrow. And I think it does need to be that soon. I think the second thing is that if there is a particular scenario that you want to see that either Chris or someone else in the community can produce, I think that needs to be asked for today, probably, to give folks enough time to propose it or to put it together. I can certainly spend some time today with the math around the new proposal, or with this proposal specifically, so I can help a little bit. I certainly, like, to be clear, like, I understand the concerns. I'm also concerned about the fact that, once this is launched, certainty matters, and that it will stay the way that it's set up. Otherwise, it's only going to create more confusion. As far as like the questions around like whether or not it's worth delegating VEHNT or not, I think there will be a group of people that will be unsure, but I think there's also a group of folks that will be doing it, with eyes open on the system that's in place, and the system can change. I think there is no such thing. First of all, there's no such thing as certainty. There's absolutely no guarantee of rewards. There's no guarantee of a particular ROI here. And so I think that is the fact. And so I think we want to make sure that like we're doing the right thing for the network. And I think uncertainty around this before the migration is the thing that I think is maybe the most important to resolve.
So, Chris, can you confirm what your requests are for the next day or so?
Well, I have no request to make except if anybody has a proposal, they state the proposal in a way that we can actually compare it based on the numbers. And I've posted these 3 scenarios comparing HIP 51 with HIP 80. And if there's any question about that, let's discuss the numbers. And if anybody thinks there's a different formula that makes more sense, then let's see the formula, let's do the comparison. Let's stop discussing things in the abstract and let's see actual numbers. And if, that's the other thing, if we don't agree on the goals, let's discuss what the goals actually are. I tried to post that too in the channel, what I think the goals are. And we obviously need to agree to some extent what the goals are. And some of the goals are relative, like how much protection should IoT get? We have a knob we can turn here in the HIP 80 model. That's just this assumed DC burn that we grant IoT even while it's still growing. And we can turn that knob. And we have 3 different versions with different assumed revenue. well, which one do you like? And if you have a proposal, state the formula, and let's compare it. Maybe we can get some clarity. That's what I'd have to say to that.
Does anybody have any idea of when they expect mobile data to start to climb a cliff? Do we know that yet?
Well, it's going to happen when Helium Mobile launches. I know the Foundation's been working on the eSIMs, but I haven't actually heard word on exactly when that launch window is going to happen. Either hopefully immediately after migration, but I haven't heard anything that's given us any kind of timetable. Might be a
Wow, you're so wise. I love.
Keep going.
oh,
I told her.
That was exciting.
Just listening back to both of you there, it was really interesting because Abe, you said we need to set this in stone; it can't change, and then Furby's just said, well, we can adjust that knob on the go. So we kind of need to be, like you say, deciding now what's happening, so people can build on that foundation that things aren't just going to change at them, right?
Well, sorry, I think maybe that was maybe that I didn't speak clearly. I meant we can turn that knob now. I want to say, is it 75,000? Is it 50,000? Is it 20,000? We can turn that knob today and tomorrow. I don't think we want to turn that knob next week or next month. That's not what I meant.
And I think that's the guess, isn't it? It's like, from my point of view, I'm full IoT, obviously, but I still think that setting a number like 75k out of the blue could mean that that's detrimental to mobile's growth. You know, so we need to kind of work out how it happens. And to me, Max's argument was always, well, we have numbers from onboarding. So if we just make mobile on board and mobile doesn't blow up, you know, it doesn't cause any problems to IoT. And if it does, they get their fair share. I think that's what he was trying to get across. And the big point that he was saying as well was that he doesn't think that we're going to get many more sub-DAOs because half of the token has gone to IoT already. They'd be in a better position to just go run a Solana coin because then they get the full remissions. You know, so how many more sub-DAOs are we actually going to get? And, you know, to make leeway for them now seems a bit silly when most of them will just go to other networks anyway.
Well, he's the one who was saying we need to welcome other sub-DAOs, and so I'm just trying to argue how we are not against that. And the argument, if they go to a different chain and onboard there, they can have all the tokens. Well, the other question is that token worth anything? I mean, if you onboard with Helium, you're going to have a token that is being carried in part by Helium Mobile, which we hope is going to be successful, and maybe later we're going to be carried by Helium IoT as well, which on the long run I think has potential to be valuable as well. So it's not a one-to-one comparison and doesn't really make any sense. And as for the argument that we should use the HIP51 score because it doesn't have any numbers we have to plug in, well, we have a number in the HIP80 score. We can turn the dial if we want, so it matches up pretty well with the results we get with the HIP51 score. So if that's what we want, that's what we can do. If we would rather have mobile get more or less, or IoT get more or less, we can turn the knob a little bit and get something different. We can match it pretty closely. So I don't see that that's an argument against doing the simpler score that solves other problems as well.
Yeah, let's also not like make someone's arguments for them. I think that's not very fair either for that person who's not here. So to Valerie's point around the to Valerie's point around time, yes, we're on the top of the hour. I think it's clear to me that we either need to have a counter proposal or at least, or specific feedback or specific modeling that's being done on this proposal. So why don't we use that as our next steps? As far as any counter proposals, I mean, I think talking about it in chat is great, but like actually just putting together just even a bulleted list, like don't worry about formatting it, just a bulleted list of goals and a specific formula that you would propose is maybe sufficient at this point, because at the very least it'll fit into the alternate or the alternatives section of this HIP, right? And I think that will at least allow people to be able to vote on this HIP versus an alternative, or at least maybe vote down this HIP because an alternative is better. So we can do that. I think that's sufficient for us to at least have a meaningful conversation around getting to a vote for this HIP. Does that work for the folks here?
Sure.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Well, I really appreciate having a chance to chat this morning. And I'm going to just, Chris and Gateholder and anyone else who's like trying to think about different proposals or different metrics, like I'm certainly going to be around today to help certainly on the modeling side. So please just ask.
Great. Appreciate it. Bye.
We'll see what comes out.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, all thanks.
Thanks all.